across. So, and the collapse is usually very rapid. So, indeed, they pose a threat to anything on the surface.
Are they getting more common?
In certain parts of the world, yes. This process usually happens where under the surface there's rock that can be dissolved, and the most common rock that is prone to being dissolved when it's underground is limestone, and limestone is a fairly common sedimentary rock. So areas where there's limestone, and particularly areas where there's lots of rainfall, are the places where that process of dissolving the rock underground can happen.
Right. And is there any truth to the suspicion that these sinkholes that are increasing all over the place in Turkey are correlated to pulling water out of the ground?
Well, it's important to understand there's two stages. So the first stage is actually to form the hole underground, like a cavern,
right?
Which is it's got a roof to begin with, and it's essentially an open cavern. And the second stage then is the roof collapse. Now that first stage takes a long time, probably hundreds to thousands of years. It's a very slow process to form underground caverns. But the reports from Turkey suggest that the collapse process is happening at a very fast rate, and it correlates with removing the underground water. Now, the thing is that once you've got an open cavity, if it's filled with water, that water provides a bit of extra support for the roof. Not a huge amount, but it might just be providing a critical amount of support for the roof. So if, as appears to be the case, the underground water is being pumped out at a much greater rate than previously, that means that over that whole area, all the already existing caverns are now at much greater risk of having the roofs fall in. So it's the rapid appearance of them is because of the roofs falling in. Probably there's lots and lots of underground caverns there that haven't yet fallen in, but because of the withdrawal of the water, they're starting to collapse a whole lot faster than they would if the water was less.
We're talking about sinkholes with a geologist and the head of the School of Earth Sciences at the University of Tasmania. You might have seen them popping up all over the joint in Turkey. Are they something we need to worry about here in Australia? And are they in part caused by climate change, causing droughts, taking more water out of the ground? So Jocelyn, I assume, just common sense would indicate to me that if there is pressure in that underground water basin, then that might provide support. And if there's a pressurized water cavity holding up the earth up on top of which you've got a farm and your cows and your tractors, and then you draw the water out of that pressurized cavity so that it's just full of air, and then the top crumples in. Then
that's right.
That's the problem.
And the problem is that it depends on the rate at which you withdraw it. So the water supply is actually, it can be replenished, but it's a fairly slow process. And as is often the case, when we want water for agriculture and so on, we want a lot of it in a short period of time. So it's the hydrologic system isn't able to adjust rapidly enough to replace the water that's being removed. So whether there's a climate change link or not, I don't know, but certainly it appears that locally there is a drought, and so the farmers are drawing much more heavily and more quickly on that underground reservoir.
Right. And just briefly, we've only got about a minute left before we crash into the news, Jocelyn, but are we at risk of sinkholes here in Australia?
Much, much lower. We do have a vast underground reservoir, the Great Artesian Basin, but very little of it involves limestone as the bedrock.
Got it. And one listener on the text line says, "Are sinkholes always circular?"
Pretty much. They're either circular circular or oval in shape.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you, Jocelyn.
My pleasure.
Lovely to talk to you. That's Professor Jocelyn McPhee, who's a geologist and the head of the School of Earth Sciences at the University of Tasmania, breaking down your Sinkhole 101, everything you ever needed to know about sinkholes. You might have seen they were popping up all over the place in Turkey last week, and we thought we'd just interrogate whether or not we are at risk of having sinkholes here. After the news, what do you need to know in the world of culture, in the world of the small screen, the big screen, stage, and theatre? Our culture vultures will be here to let you know. It's 1 o'clock.
Stay connected with your ABC. Receive local news and stories from your community delivered straight to your inbox. Sign up to the ABC Radio Sydney newsletter today at abc.net.au/connect.
Good afternoon, Adam Story with ABC News. The former Prime Minister Scott Morrison insists his decision to secretly obtain extra ministerial powers was legal and in the national interest during the pandemic. Mr Morrison has fronted the media for the first time after it was revealed he was appointed to 5 additional portfolios between 2020 and 2021. Mr Morrison says he felt he was responsible for the government's response to the pandemic and he needed the additional powers as a safeguard.
I had the power, though, to act if that was necessary. The powers that I was exercising and being sworn in administratively to those roles were lawful, based on the advice and working through those issues, as was done by the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the Office of the Governor-General, my office.
Meanwhile, the Governor-General has declined to comment on whether or not he expected Scott Morrison's additional appointments to be made public. Retired General David Hurley confirmed earlier this week that he signed off on Mr Morrison's request to administer the additional portfolios. He said all appointments were made consistent with the Constitution and publicising the move is up to the government. Questioned today by the ABC on whether he thought the appointments would be made public, the Governor-General says he'll let other inquiries run their course.
Well, I've released a statement about my role in this and my responsibilities under the principle of responsible government by which we run our country. I'm content at the moment to allow the processes the Prime Minister has put in place to run through to the next week. In the meantime, I'll do my job as I've done it in the past.
2 of the state's major emergency agencies, the State Emergency Service and the Rural Fire Service, will be partially merged to better respond to flood emergencies. Jessica Kidd has the details.
Premier Dominic Perrottet today praised the sacrifice of flood-affected communities as he promised to implement all 28 recommendations of an independent report into the floods crisis.
That will be matched by our commitment and our dedication to rebuild and recreate our communities for the future.
Back office functions of the SES and RFS will be merged to improve flood responses. Resilience New South Wales will be reshaped into Recovery New South Wales, which will oversee the first 100 days of recovery after a disaster. A reconstruction authority will be set up and there'll be land swaps and buybacks for people in flood-prone areas.
The Treasurer Jim Chalmers says the latest data has reiterated real wages are going backwards. The wage price index rose 0.7% in the June quarter, taking annual wages growth to 2.6%. That's well below inflation, which is now at 6.1% for the year. Mr Chalmers says it's a challenge the government is currently dealing with.
We're pleased to see wages growth picking up again, but it's well short of inflation, and that means real wages are still going backwards substantially.
A Sydney court has heard a former suspect in the disappearance of toddler William Tyrrell was the victim of an aggressive and improper police investigation. Here's court reporter Jamel Wells.
Former washing machine repairman Bill Spedding is suing the state of New South Wales after being acquitted of assaulting 2 children in Sydney's southwest. The 70-year-old has argued he was only ever charged because police thought he abducted William Tyrrell and wanted to punish him. Bill Spedding's barrister has made further submissions about the police investigation into William Tyrrell's disappearance. The court heard the investigation was high risk, aggressive and improper. It heard former Detective Gary Jubelin intimidated Bill Spedding, who now has a psychiatric adjustment disorder.
US Congresswoman Liz Cheney has conceded defeat in the Republican primary election in Wyoming. Here's North America correspondent Barbara Miller.
Liz Cheney's defeat in the Wyoming primary was a foregone conclusion. Cheney has been cast out by her party for her staunch criticism of Donald Trump and her role on the January 6th committee. She reinforced that criticism in her concession speech, saying she would continue to counter which he called Donald Trump's insidious lies.
This primary election is over, but now the real work begins.
Early results suggest Cheney has been defeated by the Trump-endorsed candidate, Harriet Hageman, by a margin of around 30 percentage points.
And the German film director Wolfgang Petersen has died at the age of 81. His first major success was Das Boot, the Second World War II drama, the Second World War drama about a German submarine. That was nominated for 6 Oscars. He went on to direct a series of Hollywood blockbusters, including The Never-Ending Story, In the Line of Fire, and Air Force One. A shower or two in the south this afternoon, falling as snow on the Alps above 1,600 metres, mostly fine and sunny elsewhere, mostly sunny in Sydney this afternoon, a sunny day tomorrow, 22, a possible shower developing on Friday, a top of 20. ABC News.
Act as impetus for significant action, a chance for a revitalised economic agenda powered by the potential of free and fair enterprise. But action must start now. Global forces demand that we remain competitive. Complacency cannot define Australia's future. And try as they might, the critics of competition cannot ignore the reality that it is a force for good. That's why ACCI will never cease to fight for business, boosting prosperity.
Himself to multiple ministries. Some of that pressure is also being directed towards Governor-General David Hurley with questions about what he knew and whether he could have done things differently. The Governor-General is typically an apolitical role, so it's unusual to see the Queen's representative dragged into the political fray. As for whether Mr Morrison will cave in to calls for him to quit the Parliament, he's so far resisting. Angus Randall reports.
2 days on from the revelation that Scott Morrison held 5 secret ministries, it's still the #1 talking point for MPs. Barnaby Joyce was Scott Morrison's Deputy Prime Minister in the final year of his government. He believes the former Prime Minister would have known whether his actions were illegal.
Mr Morrison has not broken any law. He's not done anything illegal. There would be a wealth of legal advice, no doubt, from the Governor-General.
Barnaby Joyce's successor as Nationals leader, David Littleproud, hasn't weighed in on the legalities, but says Scott Morrison has some work to do to build trust with his colleagues.
I think it's not so much that he appointed himself to it as the fact that he didn't tell his colleagues. I think that's the disappointing part of it, and obviously he's now having to reconcile that with those individuals.
Both David Littleproud and Barnaby Joyce say Mr Morrison should see out his term as the member for Cook in southern Sydney. While Scott Morrison's allies are facing questions over whether he should quit, the government says it's too early to rule out the possibility of legal consequences. Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill cautions anyone who thinks they know the whole story.
Be careful of anyone who is out there at the moment asserting that no laws were broken, because we do not know the answer to that yet. As Home Affairs Minister, I exercise significant legal powers personally in my role. And again, we had a situation where there were 2 ministers for Home Affairs. So if a court orders me to make a decision by a particular date, and there's 2 ministers for Home Affairs, who owns the legal responsibility for that, and how are those responsibilities dispensed with? So this is very complicated, very difficult, and it is far from apparent that no one has broken a law here.
But she's not interested in dragging Governor-General David Hurley into the fray.
The focus here is not on the Governor-General. The Governor-General is someone who is required to act on the advice of the government of the day. Let's not lose the focus here. We had a Prime Minister who, like a despot in a developing country, accumulated vast powers of government.
Professor A.J. Brown is from Griffith University and is a board member of Transparency Australia. He wants to know why so many people, including the Governor-General, went along with Scott Morrison's plan.
On one hand, the Governor-General is obliged under our system to follow the advice of the Prime Minister and the elected government of the day, but at the same time, the Governor-General has to have an awareness of the fundamental constitutional principles in the Constitution which bind everybody, which bind the Prime Minister, which bind the government, which bind the parliamentarians. And in this case, the fundamental principles of responsible government were really undermined.
Like most public policy experts, Professor Brown doubts there are any legal repercussions for the Governor-General, but he says David Hurley should have done more to ensure the government remains accountable to both the public and the Parliament.
The Governor-General would have been perfectly entitled to say to the Prime Minister, "Oh, thank you, Prime Minister. Yes, I'll accept your advice to swear you in as the Minister for Health. But I'd just like to check that the existing Minister for Health is actually aware of and understands how this will operate. Otherwise, responsible government can't work." So the Governor-General would have been perfectly entitled to do that.
He says the chances of anyone having their day in court are pretty unlikely.
I mean, constitutional questions like this, in terms of the powers and the relationships of the executive, are often regarded as non-justiciable, which means that they're not necessarily reviewable in court. But the High Court could give an opinion about the lawfulness of any arrangement in terms of whether it complies with the Constitution or not, even though the question of any kind of sanctions or outcomes are probably beyond the court.
There's a push from the Greens for Scott Morrison to be investigated by Parliament's Privileges Committee, but it's not clear what, if any, sanctions they could hand down. Independent Senator Jackie Lambie has been vocal about her frustrations with a system that allowed this to happen.
It comes down to public support, and they've lost it. And unless he comes out strong, he shouldn't be waiting for any, whether it's a legal implication or not. And I doubt if it is, because, this is how they set it up. We're not very good at doing laws in Parliament. If you haven't noticed, they seem to be falling apart these days. This is just the credibility in the eyes of Australians has gone when it comes to Scott Morrison.
Independent Senator Jackie Lambie ending that report by Angus Randall. And Scott Morrison has fronted the media in Sydney to explain why he secretly appointed himself to several ministerial portfolios and to defend his actions as Prime Minister during the pandemic. He's again apologised to his frontbench colleagues, but he still insists he did nothing wrong.
In taking on these authorities from the Governor-General, I did not instruct any department that I was to have jurisdiction or carriage of any of the issues that the ministers were dealing with on a day-to-day basis. They continued to exercise their powers as ministers fully and wholly, except in the one instance in relation to the decision that I referred to in my statement. I did not exercise those powers, and I had the power, though, to act if that was necessary. The powers that I was exercising and being sworn in administratively to those roles were lawful, based on the advice and working through those issues, as was done by the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the Office of the Governor-General, my own office. Those are obvious issues that were being addressed at the time, and we understood to be acting completely lawfully. But the point here is that at no time, because the accusation has been made that somehow this was seeking these additional powers for what purpose personally, I cannot understand. I didn't exercise them because thankfully the extreme circumstances in which I established these powers to act in, thankfully, did not arise.
Former Prime Minister Scott Morrison speaking to the media earlier. New South Wales is facing a dramatic overhaul of the way authorities respond to disasters, with the inquiry into this year's deadly floods finding a string of failures. The findings of the independent inquiry led by New South Wales Chief Scientist and Engineer Mary O'Kane and former Police Commissioner Mick Fuller have been released and include a recommendation for a new reconstruction authority to be established. We'll have more on the report in just a moment, but first, in the flood-ravaged Northern Rivers region, communities are still struggling to get back on their feet months after the disasters unfolded. Stephanie Smale reports. The devastation the floodwaters left in their wake is still clear in the city of Lismore.
It's almost palpable sometimes, the energy and the loss.
The flood swallowed Moondy Nelson's South Lismore home and the rest of the suburb. Her insurance company came through with a cash offer yesterday to repair the house, but she's not sure she could ever face the prospect of moving back in.
I just couldn't cope with the concept of it happening another time, being there and potential of losing all of my possessions, all of my memories, and myself really.
She says her community is supportive and people are doing their best to help each other through the crisis.
It's still a bit heart-wrenching, really. I mean, I live on the
eastern side of town now, and even just when I turn the corner to drive down to work and look over to South Lismore, it's kind of disheartening. And coming into the CBD, there's still a lot of buildings that haven't even been touched. It can be quite challenging at times to see the town and the people in that situation.
With hundreds of people still living in emergency accommodation, she counts herself lucky to have found a private rental so she can keep working in Lismore. She says a land buyback or swap could change her life, but she's not confident she'll get a look in.
People can get a decent amount of money, then they might have a chance of getting a property elsewhere where they might feel a bit safer, more secure, and not being treated all the time.
Residents in the town of Woodburn are battling to recover too.
Slower pace.
Cafe owner Alex Clark says he's been able to access the first half of a state government grant to start rebuilding his business, but he's not confident he can meet the requirements to get the rest. He says he's struggling to get any other financial assistance to support his wife and 2 children.
So we actually don't even have income. We haven't had income now for a couple of months. So we're just living off the scant money we have, and we've just got to deal with it.
Alex Clark's home was insured too, and he's just found a builder to start repairs. But he can't say whether he'll ever move back to live there long term either.
I can't even answer that honestly. We're just dealing with it one day at a time. It really is. If you talk to anybody down here, they'll say the same thing. They're just dealing with it as it unfolds, as good as they can. You know, it seems so immense. Like here we are 5 months later, and basically my life is nowhere.
He says the latest forecasts of another wet summer are adding to the emotional weight of the already lengthy recovery.
It's just scary. I mean, this time, when we're rebuilding, we're using different materials which will handle